Have you ever reached a birthday and felt nothing? Not sadness, not joy, just a quiet question sitting somewhere inside your chest. Is this it? When I turned 62, I did not throw a party. There were no balloons, no big dinner. My daughter called in the morning before work. My son sent a short message with a photo of his dog wearing a tiny hat. My wife kissed me on the cheek and said, "Happy birthday," the same way she has said it for 40 years. And I smiled. But later that afternoon, I sat alone at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, and I asked myself a question I had never dared to ask before. When was the last time I did something for the first time? The house was quiet, too quiet, not in a sad way, just settled. At 62, life had become predictable. I woke up at 6:30, I read the news, I watered the small plants near the window. I drove to the same grocery store every Wednesday. I paid bills on Friday. I watched the same television programs in the evening. Nothing was wrong. Nothing was broken. But nothing felt new. And I began to realize something uncomfortable. I had slowly stopped growing, not because I was forced to, not because I was sick, not because life had punished me. I simply believed, somewhere along the way, that learning was for younger people, that trying new things was for people who were still building their lives. At 62, I thought my building years were over. I told myself I had already built everything: a career, a family, a house, a routine. But one afternoon, while cleaning the garage, I found something that made me pause: an old cardboard box. Inside it were notebooks from when I was 20. In one of them, I had written a list: things I wanted to learn: play the guitar, speak basic Italian, run a marathon, write short stories. I laughed when I saw it, a gentle laugh, a little embarrassed. I never did any of those things. Not because I failed, I just got busy. Work was demanding, children needed attention, life moved quickly. And every time I thought about learning something new, I told myself, maybe next year. But next year turned into the next decade, and suddenly I was 62, holding a notebook written by a younger version of myself. I sat on the garage floor longer than I expected, dust on my hands, sunlight coming through the small window. And I asked myself something simple: what if it's not too late? The thought felt almost rebellious. At 62, people talk about slowing down, retirement, rest, grandchildren. No one talks about beginning again. That evening, I did something unusual. Instead of turning on the television, I opened my laptop. I typed 3 words into the search bar: beginner guitar lessons. My fingers hesitated before I pressed enter. It felt strangely vulnerable, like admitting I didn't know something, like stepping into a room full of younger people who might look at me and think, "Why is he here?" But when the results appeared, I noticed something surprising. There were people in their 50s, 60s, even 70s, holding guitars, smiling awkwardly, starting from zero. I watched a short video of a gray-haired man learning his first chord. His fingers moved slowly, carefully. He made mistakes. He laughed. And something inside me shifted. It wasn't about the guitar. It was about possibility. The next morning, I drove to a small music store 10 minutes from my house. I almost turned the car around twice. I told myself, "You don't need this. It's unnecessary. It's expensive. It's silly." But I kept driving. When I walked into the store, I felt like I was 16 again. Nervous, unsure, out of place. A young employee approached me and asked if I needed help. I almost said no. I almost said I was just looking. But instead, I took a breath and said something that felt very honest. I'm 62, and I think I want to learn guitar. He didn't laugh. He didn't look surprised. He just smiled and said, "That's awesome." That one word stayed with me. Awesome. No one had called one of my decisions awesome in a long time. We chose a simple acoustic guitar, nothing expensive, nothing fancy. When I held it for the first time, it felt unfamiliar, heavy, solid, full of quiet promise. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed with the guitar resting against my knee. My fingers hurt after just 10 minutes. The sound I made was not music. It was noise, but it was new noise. And for the first time in years, my mind was fully awake. I had to focus. Where do my fingers go? Why does this string sound wrong? How do I move from one chord to another? There was no space to think about aging, no space to think about retirement accounts, and no space to think about aches in my back. I was simply a beginner, and being a beginner at 62 felt strangely powerful. The next few days were humbling. My fingertips became sore. I forgot chord names. I watched the same tutorial video 5 times. But something unexpected happened. I started looking forward to evenings again. Not for television, not for routine, but for practice. 10 minutes became 15. 15 became 30. My wife would pass by the room and smile gently when she heard the awkward sounds. One evening, she sat down and listened. I apologized for how bad it sounded. She shook her head and said, "You look happy." I hadn't realized it, but she was right. I did look different. Lighter, more present, and then one afternoon, about 3 weeks after I bought the guitar, I played something that almost sounded like a song. Not perfect, not smooth, but recognizable. I stopped playing and just stared at my hands. These same hands that had typed thousands of emails, fixed broken shelves, held newborn babies, signed contracts, were now learning something entirely new. At 62, and I understood something quietly profound. I wasn't learning the guitar. I was learning how to feel alive again. Because being alive is not only about breathing, it's about stretching your mind, allowing yourself to be bad at something, and giving yourself permission to grow. I used to think growth had an age limit. Now I see that it only has a courage limit. And courage does not disappear with birthdays. Sometimes it simply waits, waiting for you to say, "What if I try?" So tonight, as I sit with my guitar resting against my shoulder, I want to ask you something gently. When was the last time you did something for the first time? Not for money, not for recognition, not because you had to, but simply because you were curious. Maybe the answer is yesterday. Maybe it was 20 years ago. But if you are listening to this and something inside you feels slightly restless, maybe that feeling is not dissatisfaction. Maybe it is possibility. And maybe, just maybe, 62 is not the end of becoming. Maybe it is the beginning of becoming again. The first month was exciting. Everything felt new. Every small improvement felt like a victory. But the second month was different. The excitement became quieter. The progress became slower. And that was when the real lesson began. At 62, I'm very familiar with comfort. I know how to stay inside what I already understand. I know how to do things I'm good at. I have spent decades building competence. At work, people used to come to me for answers. In my family, I was the one who fixed problems. I rarely felt confused. I rarely felt unsure. But learning the guitar changed that. Suddenly, and I was the one asking questions. Why does this chord buzz? Why can't my fingers move fast enough? Why does it sound right in the video, but wrong in my hands? It was uncomfortable, not painful, not dramatic, just uncomfortable in a quiet, humbling way. One evening, after struggling with the same transition between two simple chords for almost 20 minutes, I felt something rise inside me. Frustration. A voice whispered, "You're too old for this. Your fingers are stiff. Your memory is slower. This is something you should have done when you were young." For a moment, I believed that voice. I put the guitar down. I stood up. I walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water. I stared out the window into the dark backyard, and I asked myself something simple. Why does this matter so much? It was just a hobby, just a small skill, but the frustration felt bigger than the guitar. It felt like a test of whether I was willing to remain a beginner. Because being a beginner at 20 is normal, being a beginner at 62 feels exposed. When you are older, people expect you to know things, to be steady, to be certain. There is quiet pressure to maintain the image of experience. And yet here I was, sitting on the edge of my bed, failing at a basic chord change. The next day, instead of practicing immediately, I did something different. I took a notebook and wrote down exactly what I was feeling: embarrassed, impatient, self-critical, afraid of wasting time. And then I wrote one more sentence: I am allowed to grow slowly. That sentence changed something. For most of my life, growth had a deadline. Finish school by this age, get promoted by that age, save this amount by retirement. There was always a timeline, but this was different. There was no deadline, no performance review, no competition, only me and a guitar. That evening, I returned to practice with a new rule. I would not measure progress by how good I sounded. I would measure it by whether I showed up. 10 minutes. That was all I required from myself. Some days it became 20. Some days it stayed 10. But I showed up. And something unexpected began to happen. The guitar was no longer the only thing changing. I was changing. I became more patient in small daily moments. When the internet was slow, and I did not sigh as quickly. When my wife repeated a story, I listened more carefully. When my grandson struggled to tie his shoes, I knelt beside him without rushing, because I understood something I had forgotten. Learning takes time, and everyone is learning something. One Sunday afternoon, my grandson visited. He is 8 years old, curious, energetic, fearless about mistakes. He saw the guitar resting in the corner and asked, "Grandpa, can you play a song?" I hesitated. Part of me wanted to say, "Not yet," but instead, I picked it up. My fingers were not perfect. The rhythm was uneven. But I played the simple melody I had been practicing. He watched closely, and when I finished, he clapped. Not because it was impressive, but because it was real. Then he said something I did not expect. "I didn't know you were still learning things." Still learning things. The phrase echoed in my mind long after he left. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped seeing myself as someone who learns. I saw myself as someone who already learned, past tense, complete. But sitting there with sore fingertips and a slightly out-of-tune guitar, I realized something important. Learning is not an age, it is an identity. You either decide you are still someone who grows, or you quietly decide you are finished. And finishing, I discovered, feels heavier than failing. A few weeks later, I made another small decision. I signed up for a beginner group class at the local community center. The idea terrified me more than buying the guitar. Practicing alone is safe. Practicing in front of others is honest. On the first evening, I almost stayed in the car. The parking lot was half full. I saw people walking inside carrying instrument cases, some younger, some older, all strangers. My heart beat faster than it should have for something so small. But I reminded myself of the sentence in my notebook. And I'm allowed to grow slowly. When I entered the room, I noticed something comforting. No one looked confident. Everyone looked uncertain. There was a woman in her late 50s adjusting her glasses while staring nervously at her strings. There was a man who admitted he had retired last year and needed something to keep his brain awake. There was even someone older than me. We were not prodigies. We were beginners together. And something about that felt deeply human. The instructor did not rush us. We practiced one chord, then another. The room filled with uneven sounds, buzzing strings, missed notes, soft laughter. No one judged, no one competed. We were simply present. Driving home that night, I felt lighter than I had in years, not because I was suddenly talented, but because I was expanding my comfort zone, expanding my patience, expanding my idea of who I could still become. At 62, I used to measure my worth by what I had accomplished. Now I was beginning to measure it by what I was willing to attempt. There is a quiet difference between the two. Accomplishment looks backward. Attempt looks forward. And forward is a direction that does not disappear with age. One evening, while practicing alone, I stopped playing and just listened to the silence in the room. It felt different now. Not empty, not stagnant. It felt like space. Space for mistakes. It's space for growth, space for surprise. I realized that learning something new had not added noise to my life. It had added depth. It reminded me that my brain is still capable. My hands are still adaptable. My spirit is still curious. And maybe the most important realization was this: the opposite of aging is not youth. The opposite of aging is engagement. You can be young and disengaged, and you can be 62 and deeply involved in your own becoming. So if you are listening and you feel that small hesitation about starting something new, maybe it is not fear of failure. Maybe it is fear of rediscovering how alive you can still feel. And if that is true, then perhaps the discomfort is not a warning. Perhaps it is an invitation to remain unfinished. Unfinished, I am learning, is a beautiful place to be. By the third month, something subtle had changed. The guitar was no longer a new thing. It had quietly become part of my life. It leaned against the same corner of the bedroom wall. It traveled with me to class every Tuesday evening. It rested across my lap after dinner, while the house slowly settled into night. But something else had changed too: the way I saw time. For most of my adult life, time felt like something I was running out of. Deadlines, appointments, school calendars, mortgage payments, retirement planning. Time was always moving forward, and I was always trying to keep up with it. But now, at 62, with the guitar in my hands, time felt different, slower. Not because the clock moved differently, but because I did. When I practiced, I could not rush. If I tried to move too quickly between chords, the sound became messy. If I forced my fingers, they stiffened. The only way forward was patience, and patience has a rhythm. I began to notice small improvements. My fingers moved with less hesitation. The buzzing sound on the third string became less frequent. My transitions were smoother, not perfect, but steady. And that steadiness began to affect other parts of my life. One morning, I was making coffee when I realized something surprising. I was not thinking about getting older. I was thinking about the song I wanted to practice that evening. For the first time in years, I was looking forward to something that had nothing to do with responsibility. It had nothing to do with income, nothing to do with family expectations. It was simply mine. That realization felt powerful. After decades of being useful to others, I was finally being curious for myself. There is a quiet difference between usefulness and aliveness. For many years, I measured my value by how useful I was. Did I provide? Did I solve problems? Did I support everyone around me? But learning something new reminded me that I am allowed to exist beyond my usefulness. I am allowed to explore, to experiment, to fail, to improve. One afternoon, and during group class, our instructor asked each of us to play a short piece alone. My heart tightened when he said it. Playing together is safe. Playing alone feels exposed. When my turn came, I stood up slowly. The room was quiet. I could hear someone adjusting in their chair. I could hear my own breathing. I placed my fingers carefully on the strings. The first chord rang out clearly. The second one almost slipped, but I corrected it. The rhythm wavered, but it continued. It was not flawless, but it was complete. When I finished, there was gentle applause. Nothing dramatic, just encouragement. And as I sat back down, I noticed something unexpected. I was not embarrassed. I was proud. Not because I had impressed anyone, but because I had stayed present. I had not quit when it became uncomfortable. That evening, while driving home, I realized that this small experience had unlocked an old memory. When I was young, I used to enjoy being bad at things. I tried basketball even though I was short. I tried cooking even though I burned the first few meals. Failure was not personal back then. It was part of exploration. Somewhere along the way, adulthood made failure heavier. Mistakes felt expensive, embarrassment felt permanent. But sitting in that classroom at 62, I rediscovered something simple. Most people are too focused on their own growth to judge yours. We are all quietly trying, and trying is something to respect. A week later, my daughter came over for dinner. After we ate, she noticed the guitar and asked if I would play something. This time, I did not hesitate. I played the same melody I had practiced for weeks. It was smoother now, more confident. When I finished, she smiled and said, "Dad, I've never seen you take on something like this before." Her words stayed with me. She had always known me as stable, reliable, predictable, but not experimental, not adventurous. And I realized something important. It is never too late to show the people you love a new version of yourself. Growth does not only change you, it changes how others see possibility. A few days later, my grandson asked if I could teach him one chord. So we sat together on the living room floor. His fingers were small, impatient. He pressed too hard at first, then too softly. He laughed when the sound came out wrong. And I found myself saying something I had once needed to hear. "It's okay. Try again." As I guided his fingers, I understood that learning had become more than a personal hobby. It had become a bridge between generations, between past and present, between who I was and who I am still becoming. At 62, I used to think the most exciting chapters of my life were behind me. I thought adventure belonged to youth, energy belonged to youth, reinvention belonged to youth. But I am beginning to see something different. Reinvention belongs to anyone willing to remain curious. Curiosity is not loud. It does not demand attention. It simply asks questions. What if? Why not? Why now? And the beautiful thing about those questions is that they do not expire. One evening, while practicing alone, I stopped and looked at my reflection in the dark window. Gray hair, lines around my eyes, hands marked by time, and yet there was something in my posture that felt different, open, alert, alive. I realized that learning something new had not erased my age, it had expanded it. 62 no longer felt like a closing number. It felt like a continuation, a chapter, not a conclusion. If someone had told me a year ago that a simple guitar would change the way I see aging, I would have smiled politely, but now I understand. It was never about the instrument, it was about permission. Permission to begin again, permission to feel awkward, permission to grow without urgency. And perhaps the most freeing realization of all was this: there is no final version of me waiting somewhere ahead. There is only this ongoing process, this quiet unfolding, this steady becoming. And as long as I'm willing to pick up the guitar, press my fingers against unfamiliar strings, and risk an imperfect sound, I am still becoming. And becoming, I have learned, is another word for living. There was a morning, not long after my third month of learning, like when I woke up before the alarm. The house was still dark. The air felt cool. For a few seconds, I lay there without moving. And then I felt it. Not excitement, not anxiety, but anticipation. At 62, anticipation is not something I experience often. Most days are predictable, comfortable, structured. But that morning, I was thinking about a song, a simple one, 3 chords, a gentle rhythm. The instructor had said we would try to play it all the way through in class that week, and instead of worrying about whether I would make mistakes, I found myself wondering how it would feel to complete it. That difference surprised me. I was no longer afraid of failing. I was curious about finishing. I got out of bed quietly so I would not wake my wife. I made coffee. I did not turn on the television. I did not check my phone. I picked up the guitar. The first chord rang out softly in the quiet room. It was not perfect, but it was clear. The second chord followed. Then the third. I moved slowly, breathing between transitions, letting the rhythm settle into my hands. And for the first time, the song did not feel like a series of separate pieces. It felt connected, like a sentence instead of scattered words. When I reached the final chord, I let it ring longer than usual. The sound filled the room. Then it faded. And I realized something simple but powerful. I had crossed an invisible line, not from bad to good, not from beginner to expert, but from doubting to trusting. I trusted my hands. I trusted my patience. I trusted that showing up consistently had value. That morning, when my wife walked into the living room, she paused and listened. "You're getting better," she said gently. I smiled, not because she noticed improvement, but because I knew she was right, and I knew why. It was not talent, it was time. Time spent without pressure, time spent without comparison, time spent simply engaged. Later that week, in our group class, we played the full song together. There were mistakes in the room, some strings buzzed, some rhythms stumbled, but no one stopped. We moved forward as a group, and when we reached the final chord, something unexpected happened. We laughed, not because it was funny, but because it felt good. We had done something together that once felt intimidating. Driving home that night, I thought about how many times in my life I had avoided something because I was afraid of looking foolish. How many interests had I quietly dismissed because they seemed impractical? How many small dreams had I postponed because they did not fit into the serious structure of adulthood? Learning something new at 62 had not changed my career. It had not changed my finances. And it had not transformed my schedule dramatically, but it had changed my relationship with possibility. I no longer saw age as a reason to narrow my world. I began to see it as a reason to expand it carefully, deliberately, with intention. One afternoon, I received a message from a friend I had not spoken to in months. He had retired recently and felt restless. He wrote, "I don't know what to do with myself." I understood that feeling. Restlessness at this stage of life can feel confusing. You are no longer chasing promotions. You are no longer raising children. The structure that once defined your days becomes softer, and without structure, you can feel untethered. So I invited him over for coffee. The guitar rested in its usual corner. He noticed it immediately. "You play?" he asked, surprised. "I'm learning," I replied. We talked about sore fingers, about awkward first classes, about the fear of being the oldest beginner in the room. He listened quietly, and before he left, he said something thoughtful. "Maybe I need to be bad at something again." That sentence stayed with me. Being bad at something is humbling, but it is also alive. It means you are stretching beyond what you already know. A few weeks later, he called to tell me he had signed up for a beginner painting workshop. His voice sounded lighter, and in that moment, I understood something even deeper. Growth is contagious, not in a loud way, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, inspiring way. When others see you attempt something new, it gives them permission to try as well. The guitar had become more than wood and strings. It had become a symbol, a reminder that I am not finished learning, not finished exploring, not finished surprising myself. There are still songs I cannot play, chords that challenge me, rhythms that confuse me. But I no longer interpret difficulty as a signal to stop. I see it as evidence that I am stretching, and stretching, even gently, keeps the spirit flexible. Now, when I look ahead, I do not see a narrowing path. I see open space. Maybe I will learn another song next month. Maybe I will attempt to write a simple melody of my own. Maybe I will try something completely different next year, cooking a new cuisine, learning a few phrases in another language. I'm taking a photography class. The specific activity matters less than the decision behind it, the decision to remain curious, the decision to remain engaged, the decision to remain unfinished. If you had asked me a year ago what 62 would feel like, I might have described stability, security, routine, and those things are still here. But now there is something else, a quiet spark, a small but steady reminder that life does not shrink unless we allow it to. It can deepen. It can widen. It can surprise us, even now, especially now. So if you are listening and you feel that gentle whisper inside you, the one that says, "I've always wanted to try," pause for a moment. Do not rush to dismiss it. Do not measure it against practicality or age. Ask yourself instead, what if this is not about achievement? What if it is about aliveness? Because at 62, I have learned something unexpected. Starting something new does not make you younger. It makes you present, and being fully present, engaged in growth, willing to begin again, that is what makes you feel alive. Thank you for sitting with me through this story. If it made you reflect, even for a moment, I hope you carry that reflection gently into your day. And if there is something you have been quietly postponing, Perhaps tonight is a good night to begin. There is something I did not expect when I first picked up the guitar. I thought I was adding something small to my life, a hobby, a distraction, a way to fill quiet evenings. But over the months, I began to understand that I was not adding something. I was reclaiming something. When we are young, we are encouraged to try, to experiment, to explore. No one expects a child to be perfect. No one expects a teenager to have everything figured out. But somewhere between building careers and raising families, many of us slowly close the door on experimentation. We become careful. We become efficient. We become predictable. Predictable can feel safe, but predictable can also feel narrow. And I did not realize how narrow my world had quietly become until I opened it again. At 62, I used to measure my days by what I completed: bills paid, groceries bought, appointments attended, tasks finished. Now, I measure some of my days by what I practiced, what I attempted, what I improved by just one small inch. That shift changed more than my evenings. It changed my relationship with myself. There was a time, not long ago, when I would look in the mirror and mostly see history: gray hair, lines around my mouth, skin that tells stories of sun and time. I respected that history, but I did not always feel connected to my future. Learning something new gave me back a sense of forward movement. Not dramatic movement, not ambitious reinvention, just steady, gentle progression, one chord cleaner than last week, one rhythm smoother than yesterday, and that small progress began to spill into other parts of my life. I started reading differently. Instead of rereading books I already loved, I picked up one I knew nothing about. Instead of ordering the same meal at my favorite restaurant, I tried something unfamiliar. Instead of saying, "That's not for me," I began to ask, "Why not?" It is strange how one new habit can quietly loosen the grip of routine. I am not trying to become a different person. I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm simply allowing myself to remain open. One afternoon, while organizing a drawer in my desk, I found that old notebook again. The one with the list I wrote in my 20s. Play the guitar, speak basic Italian, run a marathon, write short stories. I smiled when I saw it. One item had moved from dream to reality. Not perfectly, not professionally, but honestly. And for the first time, the rest of the list did not feel like regret. It felt like possibility. I am not sure I will run a marathon. My knees might disagree. But maybe I could walk a 5K. Maybe I could learn a few Italian phrases before traveling someday. Maybe I could write short reflections like this one more often. The point is not to complete the entire list. The point is to remember that I am still allowed to want things. Desire does not expire at retirement. Curiosity does not disappear at 60. And growth does not belong only to the young. There is a quiet myth in our culture that aging means shrinking. Shrinking your ambitions, shrinking your circle, shrinking your expectations. But what if aging could mean refining instead of shrinking? Refining what truly matters, refining what genuinely brings energy, refining how we spend our attention. The guitar taught me that attention is powerful. When I practice, I am fully there. I'm not replaying old mistakes in my mind. I'm not worrying about distant uncertainties. I'm pressing my fingers against strings and listening carefully. And that kind of attention feels like meditation. It feels like respect for the present moment. One evening, my grandson asked me why I started learning at my age. He tilted his head the way children do when they are truly curious. I thought about it before answering. And I told him something simple. Because I didn't want to stop growing. He nodded, as if that made perfect sense. And maybe it does. We teach children that growing is natural, but we rarely talk about emotional or intellectual growth later in life. Yet I have discovered that growing at 62 feels different in a beautiful way. It feels voluntary, it feels intentional, it feels chosen. No one requires me to learn this instrument. No one evaluates me. No one gives me a grade. I am learning because I want to feel engaged, because I want to remain mentally awake, because I want to remind myself that my story is still being written. There will be days when practice feels repetitive. There will be days when progress slows. There will be days when I question whether it matters. But I now understand something important. The value is not in becoming impressive. The value is in becoming attentive. Attentive to what sparks interest. Attentive to what stretches comfort. Attentive to what makes the hours feel meaningful. I used to think that feeling alive required big changes, a new city, a new job, a dramatic decision. Now I see that feeling alive can begin with something small and consistent. 10 minutes a day, a willingness to look foolish, a willingness to try. If you are listening to this and you feel settled, not unhappy, not dissatisfied, just settled, I want to gently suggest something. Settled does not have to mean finished. There may be something quiet inside you that you have postponed for years, a class, a skill, a language, a creative hobby, a physical challenge. It does not have to be ambitious. It does not have to be public. It only has to be yours. Ask yourself, when was the last time you allowed yourself to be a beginner? When was the last time you practiced something with no goal other than growth? When was the last time you surprised yourself? I'm at 62. I have learned that the body ages naturally. That is part of life. But the spirit ages differently. The spirit ages when it stops engaging, when it stops wondering, when it stops reaching gently forward. I do not know how many years I have ahead of me. None of us do. But I know this. I want those years to include curiosity. I want them to include small challenges. I want them to include the humbling experience of not knowing and the quiet joy of slowly understanding. The guitar may not stay with me forever. Perhaps one day I will set it aside and try something else, and that is fine. Because the real lesson was never about the instrument, it was about identity. I am not someone who is done, I am someone who is still becoming. And if this story has resonated with you in any way, I invite you to sit quietly for a moment after this ends. Think about one thing, just one, that you have always been slightly curious about. Do not judge it. Do not calculate it. Do not compare it to anyone else. Simply acknowledge it. And then, maybe this week, take one small step toward it. Search for a beginner video, buy a simple tool, sign up for an introductory class, or even just write it down in a notebook. Because sometimes the smallest step is enough to reopen a door you thought was closed. If this story brought you a sense of calm or reflection, I invite you to continue this journey with me. Subscribe to the channel so we can explore more life stories together, slowly and thoughtfully. Leave a comment and share what you would like to begin, even if it feels small. And if you know someone who believes it is too late to try something new, consider sharing this episode with them. We are never too old to begin again. We are never too experienced to be beginners. And we are never too late to feel alive. Thank you for listening. I will see you in the next story.